The purple blood dripped steadily from Silara's side as she stumbled through the dense alien forest. Each step sent waves of pain through her four-legged body, but she forced herself to keep moving. The wound wasn't deep, but it wouldn't stop bleeding. Her species' natural healing abilities seemed useless on this cursed planet. Behind her, somewhere in the gathering darkness, she knew the human was following. They were persistent hunters. Everyone in the Centaurian army knew that. 3 years of war had taught them just how dangerous humans could be. The stories about their brutality had spread through the ranks like wildfire. Silara's antenna twitched nervously as she listened for footsteps. The forest was too quiet. Even the strange Earth-like birds that usually filled the air with their songs had gone silent. She knew what that meant. A predator was nearby. In this case, the predator walked on 2 legs and carried weapons that could end her life in an instant. Her scout mission had gone wrong from the start. The human patrol wasn't supposed to be in this sector. She had been careless, too focused on gathering data about the planet's resources, when the first shot grazed her side. Now, hours later, the blood trail she was leaving might as well have been a glowing path leading straight to her. The light was fading fast. 2 moons were rising in the purple sky, casting strange shadows through the leaves. Silara's vision, usually sharp enough to spot a dust mite at 50 paces, was beginning to blur. She had lost too much blood. Her legs trembled with each step. A branch cracked somewhere behind her. Silara's hearts began beating faster. Both of them hammered against her chest wall as fear took hold. The human was closer now, much closer than she had thought. She tried to move faster, but her wounded body betrayed her. Her front right leg caught on a root, and she crashed hard into the forest floor. The fall knocked what little breath she had left out of her lungs. As she lay there, purple blood staining the strange blue-green moss beneath her, memories flashed through her mind. She remembered her clutchmates back home, the way they used to race through the crystal forests of their homeworld. She thought about her first day of military training, how proud she had been to serve her people. Now she would die on this foreign world, alone and afraid. The sound of footsteps grew closer, heavy boots crushing leaves and twigs. The human wasn't even trying to be quiet anymore. They knew she was injured, knew she couldn't escape. Silara had seen the recordings. Everyone had. Humans were savage creatures who took pleasure in causing pain. The military briefings showed what happened to captured Centaurians, the experiments, the torture, the slow deaths. Better to die here, on her own terms, than suffer that fate. With the last of her strength, Silara rolled onto her side. If she was going to die, she would at least face her killer. Her people's honor demanded nothing less. Through her blurring vision, she saw the human emerge from the shadows between the trees. He was tall, like all humans, with dark skin and strange fur on his face. His uniform was different from the others she had seen, marked with red crosses that she didn't recognize. The human carried a weapon, but it hung at his side rather than pointed at her. In the strange moonlight, she could see his eyes studying her. She waited for the hatred, the cruel smile that the briefings had warned about. Instead, she saw something else in his expression, something that made no sense. The human was lowering his weapon. This had to be a trick, some new form of torture. Silara closed her eyes and waited for the shot that would end her life. It never came. The silence stretched on. Each second felt like an eternity to Silara as she waited for death. When nothing happened, she slowly opened her eyes again. The human had placed his weapon on the ground and was reaching into a large pack on his back. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he was trying not to frighten her. That made no sense. Humans were supposed to be violent creatures who showed no mercy. "I'm not going to hurt you," the human said in his harsh language. Of course, Silara couldn't understand the words, but his tone was surprisingly gentle. He pulled something white from his pack, some kind of box with a red cross matching the ones on his uniform. Silara's antenna twitched in confusion. Her vision was getting worse. dark spots dancing at the edges, but she could see the human approaching carefully. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she had no strength left. The blood loss was too severe. The human knelt beside her, keeping his movements slow. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown color, and they held none of the cruelty she had expected. He opened the white box, revealing various items she didn't recognize. "My name is Marcus," he said, pointing to himself. "I was a combat medic. I can help." Again, the words meant nothing to her, but the gesture was clear. He was trying to communicate. When he reached toward her wound, Scylla flinched. The human, Marcus, immediately pulled his hand back. He showed her a small bottle and some white bandages first, then mimicked cleaning and wrapping motions. He was asking permission, she realized with shock. No one had ever told her humans could be considerate. Her vision blurred again, and this time Scylla knew she was running out of time. The choice was simple: trust this strange human or bleed to death. With a slight nod of her head, she gave him permission to proceed. Marcus worked quickly but gently. The liquid he poured on her wound stung, making her hiss in pain, but it seemed to slow the bleeding. His hands were surprisingly steady as he applied pressure and began wrapping the injury with clean white bandages. As he worked, he kept talking in a soft, calm voice. Scylla didn't understand the words, but the sound was oddly comforting. This went against everything she had been taught about humans. They were supposed to be brutal, primitive creatures. Yet here was one treating her wounds with more care than some of her own medics would have shown. The moons climbed higher in the sky as Marcus continued his work. He pulled out more items from his pack, something that looked like water and small colored tablets. He offered them to her carefully, making drinking motions. Scylla hesitated. This could be poison, but if the human had wanted to kill her, he had already had plenty of chances. With trembling hands, she accepted the water and tablets. The liquid was cool and clean, and whatever medicine he had given her seemed to help clear her head a little. When he finished, Marcus sat back on his heels and studied his work. The bandages were secure, and the bleeding had almost stopped. Scylla could already feel some of her strength returning, though she was still weak. In the distance, a loud explosion shattered the night's quiet. Both of them tensed. Marcus quickly gathered his medical supplies, looking worried. He pointed to the sky, where faint lights could be seen through the trees. Ships were moving into position above them. Something was wrong. These weren't just regular patrols. The patterns of movement suggested a much larger operation was underway. Marcus held out his hand to Scylla, his expression urgent. She stared at it, confused. Was he offering to help her escape? Another explosion, closer this time, made the decision for her. Whatever was happening, staying here meant certain death. With only slight hesitation, Scylla took his hand. Thunder rolled across the sky as Marcus helped Scylla move through the darkening forest. Rain began to fall, first as a light drizzle, then in heavy sheets that made it hard to see. The bandages on her wound were holding, but every step was still painful. Marcus seemed to know where he was going. He led them away from the explosions, deeper into the forest where the trees grew closer together. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the worried look on his face as he checked their surroundings. He kept one hand ready near where his weapon should have been, but Scylla noticed he hadn't picked it up again after treating her wounds. The rain grew heavier, and the wind picked up strength. Through the storm, Scylla's sensitive antenna could detect vibrations in the air. Ships were still moving above them, hidden by the thick storm clouds. Whatever was happening up there, it wasn't good. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a rocky hillside. Marcus gestured for her to wait as he pushed aside some hanging vines, revealing the mouth of a cave. He pulled out a small light from his pack and shined it inside. Satisfied it was empty, he motioned for her to follow. The cave was dry and went deep into the hillside. Marcus led them far enough in that the storm's noise became distant. When they stopped, Silera carefully lowered herself to the ground, exhausted. Her wound throbbed, but at least she wasn't bleeding anymore. Marcus set up his light so it cast a soft glow around them. Then he did something surprising. He sat down cross-legged on the ground and began drawing in the dirt with his finger. First, he drew a simple figure that looked like himself, then pointed to his chest and said, "Marcus again." Understanding what he was trying to do, Silera leaned forward. With her own finger, she drew a basic shape representing a centaurian, then touched her chest. "Silera," she said in her own language. A small smile appeared on Marcus's face. He nodded, then continued drawing. He sketched simple pictures showing himself as part of the human military, then crossing it out. Through his drawings, he tried to explain that he had left the human army. He drew medical symbols and showed himself helping both humans and centaurians. Silera watched carefully. She had never heard of a human deserter before. Their military briefings always said humans were blindly loyal to their commanders. But here was one who had chosen to leave, who seemed to care more about helping others than fighting. She decided to try communicating back. In the dirt, she drew her scout insignia and made motions of observing and recording. Marcus nodded in understanding. Then she drew the explosion symbols he had used earlier, with a question mark. Marcus's face grew serious. He drew more ships, both human and centaurian, and showed them fighting. Then he drew a third type of ship, one Silera didn't recognize. Through his pictures, he tried to explain that both their peoples were in danger. A loud crash of thunder made them both jump. Marcus quickly checked the cave entrance, then returned to their small circle of light. He pulled some food from his pack, simple dried meat, and what looked like emergency rations. He offered half to Silera. As they ate in silence, Silera studied the human more carefully. His uniform was worn and patched in places. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept well in days. Yet despite his obvious exhaustion, he had still stopped to help an enemy. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside the cave, two supposed enemies shared a meal and tried to understand each other through pictures drawn in dirt. Silera realized that everything she thought she knew about humans might be wrong. Then they heard voices approaching the cave entrance. Marcus quickly extinguished their light. The cave plunged into darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning from the entrance. The voices grew closer, harsh commands in both human and centaurian languages. Silera's antenna picked up multiple sets of footsteps. At least 6 different beings were approaching, moving in a search pattern. Through the storm's noise, she could make out words in her own language. "Find the traitor," and "execute on sight." Marcus touched her arm gently and pointed deeper into the cave. In the dim light, she could see his eyes asking a question. Did she trust him enough to follow? Another flash of lightning revealed armed figures silhouetted at the cave entrance. Silera nodded quickly. They had no choice. Moving as quietly as possible, they crept deeper into the cave system. Marcus kept one hand on the wall and the other holding Silera's arm to guide her. Her night vision was better than his, but the cave's twists and turns were confusing. Behind them, lights from the search party bounced off the walls. "The blood trail leads this way," someone shouted in the human language. Marcus tensed. He might not have understood the centaurian words earlier, but he clearly knew what these meant. They reached a fork in the cave. Both paths disappeared into darkness. Marcus hesitated, but Silera's antenna detected a faint air current from the left passage. She pulled him that way, hoping it might lead to another exit. The voices echoed through the cave. They're working together. The human helped the scout escape. This time, it was in Centaurian. Silera's hearts beat faster. They were hunting both of them now. The passage grew narrower. Marcus had to crouch to avoid hitting his head, while Silera's 4-legged form barely fit through some spots. Her wound screamed in protest as she squeezed through tight spaces, but she forced herself to keep moving. Suddenly, Marcus stopped. Zil-Ara almost ran into him. Ahead, the passage opened into a larger chamber, but more importantly, there was light. Not from the search party, but from above. A hole in the cave ceiling let in the storm's lightning flashes. They hurried into the chamber. Zil-Ara looked up through the opening. It was too high to reach, but she could see trees swaying in the wind. This chamber was their dead end. Marcus was already moving, checking the walls for anything they could use. He found some loose rocks and began piling them quietly. Through gestures, he explained his plan. They would ambush their pursuers here. Zil-Ara understood. The narrow passage would force their hunters to come through one at a time. It wasn't much of an advantage, but it was all they had. She helped Marcus gather more rocks, ignoring the pain in her side. The searchlights grew brighter. Voices echoed closer. Marcus positioned himself on one side of the passage entrance, rocks ready. Zil-Ara took the other side, her powerful legs coiled to strike. The first hunter appeared, a human military police officer. Before he could raise his weapon, Marcus struck. The rock hit the man's hand, making him drop his gun. Zil-Ara's kick sent him flying into the chamber wall. 2 Centaurian soldiers charged in next. They hesitated for a crucial second, surprised to see one of their own fighting alongside a human. That hesitation cost them. More rocks flew, followed by precise strikes from both Marcus and Zil-Ara. But more were coming. A shot rang out, missing Marcus by inches. Zil-Ara pulled him back as return fire lit up the passage. They pressed themselves against the chamber walls, rocks their only weapons against guns. Lightning flashed through the ceiling hole again. In that brief moment, Zil-Ara saw something that changed everything. Markings on the hunters' uniforms that didn't match either military. These weren't regular soldiers. Through the chaos, she caught Marcus's eye. He had seen it too. The question was, who were these people really working for? Another shot exploded against the wall between them. Rock fragments flew everywhere as more shots hit the chamber walls. Marcus grabbed a fallen soldier's weapon, then tossed another to Zil-Ara. Through quick hand signals, they coordinated their defense, taking turns firing back while searching for a way out. In the chaotic firefight, Zil-Ara studied their attackers more carefully. Their uniforms looked like military gear, but something was wrong. The insignias were slightly different, and their tactics weren't standard for either human or Centaurian forces. A break in the shooting allowed Marcus to slide closer to her. He pulled something from one of the unconscious soldiers, a data tablet. Its screen glowed with an unfamiliar logo. Proximan Corporation, Private Military Division. Zil-Ara's antenna twitched in recognition. She had seen this name before, in her scout reports. Proximan was supposed to be a neutral trading company that dealt with both sides of the war. But these weren't traders. They were highly trained killers. More attackers pushed into the chamber. Marcus and Zil-Ara retreated to higher ground, using fallen rocks as cover. As they fought, Marcus pointed urgently at the tablet, then at his medkit's logo, making a connection. The same company that made military medical supplies was sending soldiers to kill them. Lightning flashed through the ceiling hole again, and Zil-Ara noticed something they'd missed before. Thick vines hung down from the opening, sturdy enough to possibly hold their weight. She nudged Marcus and pointed up. Understanding crossed his face, but reaching the vines meant crossing open ground under fire. Marcus looked at the tablet again, then made a decision. He pushed it into Zil-Ara's hands and pointed to himself, then the open space. He was offering to draw their fire. Zil-Ara shook her head firmly. She had seen enough humans sacrifice themselves in battle. Instead, she pointed to both of them, then the vines. Together, or not at all. Marcus's surprised smile told her he wasn't used to aliens caring about his survival. They waited for the next lightning flash. When it came, Marcus threw their remaining rocks to the far side of the chamber. The attackers turned toward the noise. In that moment, both Marcus and Zil-Ara sprinted for the vines. Shots followed them, but the darkness and rain made it hard for their attackers to aim. Marcus reached the vines first. Despite his exhaustion, he helped boost Scylla up, her forelegs scrambling for purchase on the wet cave wall. Then she reached down and pulled him up after her. They emerged into the storm-swept forest. The rain had gotten worse, turning the ground to mud. Behind them, angry shouts echoed from the cave as their pursuers realized their escape route. "Wait," Marcus said, though he knew she couldn't understand the word. He pointed at the tablet she still carried. Taking shelter under a large tree, they examined its contents together. The tablet held classified documents, supply route information, and most importantly, proof. Proximan Corporation had been secretly selling weapons to both sides, deliberately prolonging the war. But that wasn't all. There were mining surveys, drilling sites, resource extraction plans, all for planets in both human and Centaurian space. Scylla's hand shook with anger as she understood. Her people weren't dying for any great cause. They were dying so this company could steal resources, while everyone was distracted by fighting. Marcus's expression showed he felt the same rage. He pointed to the tablet, then made a broadcasting motion with his hands. Scylla nodded. This information needed to reach both their species. A bullet whizzed past them. Their pursuers had found the cave exit. Marcus pointed to a ridge in the distance, where communication towers rose above the trees. If they could reach those towers, they might have a chance to expose the truth. Lightning split the sky as they ran into the darkness. The tablet clutched tightly in Scylla's hands. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The communication towers grew larger as Marcus and Scylla approached through the rain-soaked forest. Lightning revealed the Proximan Corporation logo on the facility's walls. This was one of their private broadcasting stations, disguised as a military outpost. Scylla's wound had started bleeding again from all the running, but she forced herself to keep moving. The tablet felt heavy in her hands. All those lives lost, all the destruction. And for what? Corporate profits. Her anger gave her strength to push through the pain. Marcus stopped at the edge of the forest, studying the facility's defenses. 2 guard towers, automated security turrets, and at least 8 armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Behind them, their pursuers' lights bobbed through the trees, getting closer. They needed a plan. Marcus pointed to himself, then the front gate, making explosion motions with his hands. A distraction. Then he pointed to Scylla and the side wall, which had maintenance ladders leading to the broadcast equipment. Scylla shook her head and pointed to his medical kit. After treating her wound, it still held some supplies. She made mixing motions, then pointed to the guard towers. Marcus's eyes lit up with understanding. Her species had been trained in basic chemistry for emergency field operations. Working quickly under the cover of thick bushes, they combined medical supplies with rainwater. Marcus added something from an emergency flare in his pocket. The result was several small containers of smoking liquid. Thunder crashed overhead as they put their plan in motion. Scylla crept toward the first guard tower, while Marcus moved to the second. The pursuing Proximan soldiers were almost upon them. It was now or never. On Marcus's signal, they threw their makeshift smoke bombs. Dense purple clouds erupted around both guard towers. Alarms blared as confused shouts filled the air. Guards rushed toward the smoke, weapons ready. In the chaos, Marcus and Scylla slipped through gaps in the patrol pattern. The rain helped mask their movement as they reached the facility's wall. Scylla's forelegs gave her better stability on the wet metal ladder. She climbed first, helping pull Marcus up behind her. They'd reached the broadcast level just as their pursuers burst from the forest. More alarms sounded. The guards finally spotted them, and gunfire erupted from below. Marcus and Scylla ducked behind satellite dishes as bullets pinged off metal around them. The broadcast control room was just ahead. Through the window, they could see 2 technicians inside, frantically working at their stations. One reached for an alarm button, but stopped when he saw Scylla's stolen weapon pointed at him. Marcus quickly secured the room, while Silera examined the communication equipment. Her scout training included basic knowledge of broadcast systems. This station was powerful enough to reach both human and Centaurian command centers. But there was a problem. The system needed authorization codes to broadcast on military channels. Without them, no one would receive their message. Silera growled in frustration. Then Marcus pointed excitedly at one of the technicians. The man's security badge had high-level Proximan clearance. Under the weapons threat, the technician reluctantly logged into the system. Outside, the sounds of fighting grew louder. Security forces were heading up to their level. Marcus barricaded the door, while Silera connected the tablet to the broadcast system. Her hands moved quickly over the controls, preparing a data burst that would send everything. The weapon sales records, the mining plans, all of it, to both species' military commands. The door shuddered as someone tried to break through. They were out of time. Silera looked at Marcus, whom nodded encouragingly. This was their only chance to stop the war, to save both their peoples from being manipulated any longer. Just as the door began to crack, Silera's hand moved to press the broadcast button. A shot rang out through the broken door. The shot that came through the broken door hit Silera in her already wounded side. She collapsed, her finger still inches from the broadcast button. Purple blood spread across the floor as Marcus ran to her, his face twisted with concern. Security forces burst into the room, weapons raised. Leading them was a Proximan commander, his uniform decorated with corporate medals. "Step away from the console," he ordered, aiming at Marcus's head. But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He placed himself between the guns and Silera. "She needs medical attention," he said firmly, already pulling supplies from his kit. The commander laughed. "A human protecting a Centaurian. How touching. But you're both going to die here. Can't let you ruin our profitable little war after all." Silera watched through blurring vision as Marcus stood his ground. His hands were steady as he pressed bandages against her wound, ignoring the weapons pointed at him. In all her years of combat, she had never seen such courage or such kindness. "Last chance," the commander warned. "Move away from the alien." Marcus's response was to wrap another bandage around Silera's injury. The commander sighed and gave the order to fire. But in that moment, something remarkable happened. The technician they had captured, who had watched everything unfold, made a decision. As the guards prepared to shoot, he lunged for the broadcast console. The commander turned, startled. That split second was all Marcus needed. He grabbed a smoke bomb they had held in reserve and threw it. Dense purple smoke filled the room as chaos erupted. Through the confusion, Silera felt Marcus lifting her toward the console. She understood. One last chance. Fighting through the pain, she reached out with trembling fingers and pressed the broadcast button. The screen lit up green. "Transmission complete," flashed across it in both human and Centaurian text. The smoke began to clear. The commander stood there, fury on his face, his weapon aimed. But before he could fire, new alarms started blaring. On every screen in the room, messages began appearing. Both human and Centaurian military commands responding to the data they had just received. The guards looked uncertain now. Some lowered their weapons as they read the incoming messages. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of corporate manipulation exposed in an instant. "It's over," Marcus said to the commander, still protecting Silera. "The truth is out." The commander's face twisted with rage. He raised his weapon for one final shot, but never got the chance. The technician tackled him from behind, sending the shot wide. More messages flooded the screens. Orders from both military commands. "Cease all hostilities. Stand down." The war was over. Silera felt her consciousness fading, but she smiled. They had done it. As medics from both sides arrived, called by the technician during the chaos, she saw the guards laying down their weapons. Former enemies were helping each other, just as she and Marcus had done. 3 months later, Scylla stood on her 4 legs before a joint council of human and Centaurian leaders. Her wounds had healed, leaving only scars to remind her of that night. Beside her stood Marcus, wearing a new uniform, one that represented the newly formed Joint Medical Corps. As they received medals for peace from both species, Scylla remembered how she had once expected Marcus to kill her in that forest. Instead, he had shown her that the universe held more possibility for good than she had ever imagined. The war was over. Proximan's leaders faced justice, and something new had begun. Humans and Centaurians working together, learning from each other, all because one human had chosen to help instead of harm, and one Centaurian had learned to trust instead of fear. As they left the ceremony, Marcus smiled at her. No words were needed between them anymore. They had discovered the most unthinkable thing of all: hope.